Sarah Mitchell had always been fascinated by helicopters. As a child, she would stand in her backyard, watching the emergency medical helicopters fly overhead to the nearby hospital. She dreamed of one day sitting in that pilot's seat, but life had other plans. Instead, she became a nurse, dedicating her life to saving others on the ground rather than in the air. At 32, Sarah worked at Metropolitan General Hospital in Denver. Her shifts were demanding, often stretching 12 hours or more. But she loved the adrenaline rush of emergency medicine. She was known among her colleagues for staying calm under pressure, a trait that would prove invaluable in ways she never imagined. The storm clouds had been gathering since early morning on that fateful Tuesday in March. Weather reports warned of severe thunderstorms moving through the Colorado Rockies, with winds expected to reach dangerous speeds. Despite the warnings, the hospital's emergency helicopter service remained operational. Lives were at stake, and the medical team couldn't afford to ground their aircraft for every storm warning. Dr. James Harrison, the hospital's chief flight physician, had been Sarah's mentor for 3 years. He was a seasoned professional who had served in military medicine before transitioning to civilian emergency response. James had always admired Sarah's quick thinking and steady hands during medical emergencies, but he had no idea that her interests extended beyond nursing. What James didn't know was that Sarah had been secretly taking helicopter flying lessons for the past 2 years. Every weekend, when she wasn't working, she would drive to a small airfield outside the city where an old Vietnam veteran named Tom Rodriguez taught civilian pilots. Tom had noticed something special in Sarah from her very first lesson. She had natural spatial awareness and an intuitive understanding of aircraft dynamics that couldn't be taught. Sarah had logged over 200 hours of flight time, though she hadn't yet obtained her commercial pilot's license. She kept her flying lessons private, partly because she wasn't sure if she wanted to change careers, and partly because she enjoyed having something that was entirely her own. The hospital staff knew her as a dedicated nurse, not someone who spent her free time learning to navigate the skies. The emergency call came in at 2:47 p.m. A construction worker had fallen from a scaffolding at a remote mountain site, sustaining critical injuries that required immediate airlift to the trauma center. The location was accessible only by helicopter, making ground transportation impossible given the terrain and the patient's condition. Captain Mike Torres, the hospital's primary helicopter pilot, was already suited up and running through his pre-flight checklist when the weather took a dramatic turn for the worse. The wind speeds had increased beyond safe flying parameters, and visibility was decreasing rapidly as the storm intensified. Mike was an experienced pilot with over 15 years of flight time, but even he had to admit that the conditions were becoming too dangerous. Dr. Harrison stood in the helicopter bay, watching the storm intensify through the large windows. The injured worker's condition was deteriorating according to the radio reports from the construction site. Every minute that passed reduced the chances of a successful outcome. The medical team was caught between the urgency of the mission and the reality of the dangerous weather conditions. "We need to make a decision," Mike called out over the increasing wind noise. "These conditions are right at the edge of what's safe for flight operations." Sarah had been preparing the medical equipment for the rescue mission when she overheard the conversation between Mike and Dr. Harrison. She knew from her flight training with Tom that experienced pilots often had to make difficult decisions about weather conditions. The difference between a successful mission and a tragedy often came down to pilot skill and judgment. As she secured the medical supplies, Sarah found herself mentally running through the weather assessment procedures Tom had taught her. She evaluated wind direction, visibility conditions, and storm movement patterns. Her training had included extensive work in challenging weather scenarios, partly because Tom believed that real-world flying often involved less than perfect conditions. The radio crackled with another update from the construction site. The injured worker's vital signs were becoming increasingly unstable. The on-site paramedic reported that without immediate surgical intervention, they were looking at a possible fatality. The pressure to launch the rescue mission was mounting, but the weather was not cooperating. Mike made the difficult decision that safety had to come first. "I can't take this bird up in these conditions," he announced to the medical team. "The wind shear patterns are too unpredictable, and visibility is dropping below minimum safe parameters." Dr. Harrison understood the pilot's decision, but the weight of the situation was evident on his face. They had a patient who needed immediate help, and they were grounded by weather that seemed to be getting worse by the minute. The hospital's backup pilot was out of state at a training conference, leaving them with limited options. Sarah had been listening to the entire conversation while finishing her equipment preparations. She knew that Mike was making the right call from a safety perspective, but she also knew that her own training might have prepared her for exactly this type of challenging situation. Tom had always emphasized that helicopter emergency services required pilots who could operate safely in marginal weather conditions. The moment that would change everything came when Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She approached Dr. Harrison and Mike with a confidence that seemed to come from nowhere. "I might be able to help," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the storm noise. Both men looked at her with confusion. Dr. Harrison knew Sarah as one of his best nurses, but this was completely outside her area of expertise. Mike assumed she was offering to coordinate communications or provide some other ground-based support. "What do you mean?" Dr. Harrison asked. Sarah took a deep breath before responding. "I've been training as a helicopter pilot for the past 2 years. I'm not commercially licensed yet, but I have significant flight experience, including training in challenging weather conditions." The revelation stunned both men into silence. Mike was the first to recover, his expression shifting from surprise to something approaching disbelief. "You're untrained for this," he said firmly. "Flying in emergency medical conditions during a severe storm is completely different from training flights. This isn't the time for someone to learn on the job." Sarah understood Mike's reaction, but she also knew that her training had been specifically designed to prepare pilots for real-world emergency situations. Tom had been methodical in exposing her to progressively more challenging scenarios, always emphasizing that emergency flying required different skills than recreational piloting. "Tom Rodriguez has been training me," she explained. "His program focuses specifically on emergency response scenarios. I've logged significant time in weather conditions similar to what we're facing now." Mike knew Tom's reputation. The old veteran was respected throughout the aviation community for his thorough and demanding training methods. Pilots who learned from Tom were known for their competence in challenging situations. Still, the leap from training scenarios to an actual emergency rescue mission was enormous. Dr. Harrison found himself in an impossible position. He had a critically injured patient who needed immediate transport, a qualified pilot who refused to fly due to dangerous conditions, and a nurse claiming to have pilot training that might make the mission possible. The decision he made in the next few minutes would affect multiple lives. The storm continued to intensify outside, and the radio updates from the construction site were becoming increasingly urgent. Time was running out for the injured worker, and conventional rescue options were limited by the remote location and severe weather. Sarah stood quietly, waiting for a response, knowing that her offer had created a situation that nobody had anticipated. What happened next would test everyone's judgment, skill, and courage in ways they never expected. The peaceful hospital helicopter bay was about to become the staging ground for a rescue mission that would push the limits of human capability and determination. Sarah's secret training was about to face its ultimate test, and the outcome would determine whether her years of preparation had truly prepared her for the moment when lives hung in the balance. Dr. Harrison stared at Sarah for what felt like an eternity, weighing impossible options. The radio crackled again with increasingly desperate reports from the construction site. The injured worker's blood pressure was dropping, and the on-site paramedic was running out of ways to stabilize him. Every passing minute reduced their chances of a successful outcome. Mike Torres shook his head vigorously. "James, you can't be seriously considering this. She's a nurse, not a certified emergency pilot. The liability alone would shut down the program." Sarah remained calm, understanding Mike's concerns, but knowing she had information that might change the equation. "I need to show you something," she said, pulling out her logbook from her flight bag. She always carried it, a habit Tom had insisted upon. 237 hours of flight time, including 43 hours of weather training and emergency scenario practice. Mike examined the logbook, his expression shifting as he reviewed the detailed entries. Tom Rodriguez's signature appeared throughout, validating each training session. The progression was methodical and thorough, covering everything from basic flight operations to advanced emergency procedures. More importantly, the weather training logs showed extensive work in conditions similar to what they were currently facing. Tom signed off on crosswind landings up to 35 knots, Mike noted, his voice betraying a hint of respect. "That's more advanced training than some commercial pilots receive." Dr. Harrison was torn between medical necessity and institutional responsibility. As chief flight physician, he had the authority to make emergency decisions, but using an unlicensed pilot would be unprecedented. However, the alternative was watching a patient die when they potentially had the means to save him. "What's your assessment of current conditions?" Dr. Harrison asked Sarah, testing her situational awareness. Sarah had been continuously monitoring the weather since arriving for her shift. "Wind is gusting to 32 knots from the southwest, creating challenging but manageable crosswind conditions for the mountain landing site. Visibility is reduced, but still within operational parameters if we maintain a lower altitude approach. The storm system is moving northeast, which means conditions should improve during our return flight." Mike was impressed, despite himself. Sarah's weather assessment was accurate and demonstrated the kind of situational awareness that separated competent pilots from dangerous ones. Still, the gap between training and real emergency operations remained substantial. "Even if your assessment is correct," Mike argued, "emergency medical flying requires split-second decisions while managing patient care, navigation, and weather simultaneously. Training scenarios can't replicate that pressure." Sarah nodded, acknowledging the validity of his concerns. Tom specifically designed scenarios to test decision-making under pressure. We practiced medical evacuation flights with actors playing critical patients while dealing with simulated weather emergencies. It's not exactly the same, but it's closer than you might think. The radio interrupted their debate with another update that changed everything. The construction site paramedic reported that the patient was going into shock and had minutes, not hours, before his condition became irreversible. Ground transportation was impossible due to the remote location and weather conditions blocking road access. Dr. Harrison made his decision. "Sarah, I'm going to ask you some specific questions about emergency procedures. If you can answer them correctly, I'll consider authorizing this flight under emergency medical protocols." What followed was an intense technical discussion covering emergency landing procedures, power failure protocols, and medical evacuation safety requirements. Sarah answered each question with the precision and confidence that Tom's training had instilled in her. Her responses demonstrated not just theoretical knowledge, but practical understanding of how to apply procedures under stress. Mike found himself reconsidering his opposition. Sarah's technical knowledge was solid, and her calm demeanor under pressure was exactly what emergency flying required. However, he insisted on one crucial condition. "If we do this, I'm going as co-pilot," Mike declared. "I can't legally prevent you from flying under emergency medical authorization, but I can provide guidance and take control if necessary." Sarah readily agreed to the arrangement. Having Mike's experience available would be invaluable, and his presence would also address some of the safety concerns. Dr. Harrison completed the emergency authorization paperwork, creating an official record of the unusual circumstances that necessitated using an unlicensed pilot. The helicopter chosen for the mission was a Eurocopter EC-135, a medium-sized aircraft specifically designed for emergency medical services. Sarah was familiar with the type from her training, though she had logged most of her hours in smaller aircraft. Mike quickly briefed her on the specific systems and emergency procedures unique to this particular helicopter. As they completed the pre-flight checklist, Sarah felt the familiar combination of nervousness and excitement that always accompanied challenging flights. Tom had taught her to channel that energy into heightened focus and awareness. Every switch, gauge, and control had to be perfect before they could launch into the deteriorating weather conditions. The medical team loaded their equipment while Sarah and Mike completed their final preparations. Dr. Harrison would accompany them to provide medical care during the flight and at the rescue site. The weight distribution had to be carefully calculated to ensure the helicopter remained within safe operating parameters throughout the mission. Sarah's hands moved through the startup sequence with practiced precision. The helicopter's engines wound up to operating speed, and the familiar vibration of the rotors filled the cabin. Mike monitored every action, ready to intervene if necessary, but impressed by her smooth technique. "Tower, this is Medflight 7 requesting emergency departure clearance," Sarah radioed to air traffic control. Her voice was steady and professional, betraying none of the anxiety she felt about the mission ahead. "Medflight 7, you are cleared for emergency departure. Be advised that wind conditions are marginal and deteriorating. Recommend extreme caution during all phases of flight." Sarah acknowledged the clearance and began the delicate process of lifting off in challenging wind conditions. The helicopter responded to her inputs with the characteristic sensitivity that made emergency flying both demanding and rewarding. Crosswinds immediately tested her skill as she worked to maintain precise control while climbing to their cruising altitude. Mike watched her technique carefully, noting how she made smooth, deliberate control inputs rather than the jerky overcorrections that often characterized inexperienced pilots in challenging conditions. Her training was evident in every aspect of her flying, from her scanning patterns to her radio communications. The flight to the construction site would take 23 minutes under normal conditions, but the weather was forcing them to take a longer route to avoid the worst of the turbulence. Sarah navigated using both electronic systems and traditional piloting techniques, cross-checking her position constantly to ensure they remained on course. Halfway to their destination, they encountered the most severe turbulence of the flight. The helicopter bucked and rolled as invisible air currents created by the mountainous terrain and storm system threw them around the sky. Sarah fought to maintain control, her training taking over as she made the rapid adjustments necessary to keep them stable. "Nice work," Mike commented, his respect for her abilities growing with each challenge she successfully managed. "Tom taught you well." Dr. Harrison, monitoring the patient's condition via radio, provided updates that added urgency to their mission. The construction worker was hanging on, but barely. Every minute in the air was critical, yet rushing could lead to mistakes that might cost all their lives. As they approached the landing site, Sarah faced her greatest challenge yet. The construction site was located on a narrow mountain plateau surrounded by steep terrain. The landing area was small, surrounded by equipment and debris that created additional hazards. Worse, the wind was creating dangerous downdrafts and updrafts as it flowed over the irregular terrain. Mike provided guidance on the approach pattern, but ultimately, the landing would depend entirely on Sarah's skill and judgment. She studied the site carefully, identifying wind patterns and potential obstacles while planning her approach path. Tom's training had included hundreds of practice approaches to difficult landing sites, but this was her first time doing it with lives at stake. The injured worker was visible on the ground, surrounded by his co-workers and the paramedic who had been providing emergency care. Time was running out, and everything depended on Sarah's ability to safely navigate the final, most dangerous phase of their rescue mission. As she began her approach, fighting wind gusts that tried to push the helicopter off course, Sarah realized that all her training had led to this moment. The storm raged around them, the landing site seemed impossibly small, and the weight of responsibility felt overwhelming. Yet her hands remained steady on the controls, and her mind stayed focused on the technical requirements of the task ahead. The outcome of the mission would be determined in the next few minutes, as Sarah attempted to prove that her unconventional path to the pilot's seat had prepared her for one of the most challenging situations any emergency pilot could face. The approach to the landing site tested every skill Sarah had learned during her 2 years of intensive training. Wind gusts of nearly 35 knots created constantly changing conditions that required immediate adjustments to maintain control. The helicopter swayed and pitched as invisible air currents grabbed at the aircraft, trying to push it off the narrow approach path. Sarah's eyes moved in a continuous scan pattern that Tom had drilled into her during countless training sessions. Airspeed indicator, altitude, wind direction, obstacle clearance, power settings, and rotor RPM all had to be monitored simultaneously while making the precise control inputs necessary to maintain a safe approach angle. 30 feet, looking good, Mike called out, providing the altitude references that allowed Sarah to focus on the challenging flying requirements. His voice was steady and professional, though privately he was amazed by her skill level. Few pilots with her limited experience would have attempted this approach, let alone executed it with such precision. The construction workers on the ground had cleared the improvised landing zone as much as possible, but space remained extremely limited. Large pieces of equipment created obstacles on multiple sides, and loose debris threatened to become dangerous projectiles when struck by rotor wash. Sarah had to balance the need for a controlled descent with the requirement to minimize the time spent in the most vulnerable phase of flight. At 20 feet above the ground, a sudden wind gust caught the helicopter's tail, threatening to spin them into the construction equipment. Sarah responded instantly with precise rudder control and power adjustments, countering the unwanted rotation while maintaining their descent path. The maneuver was executed so smoothly that the passengers barely felt the helicopter's movement, though Mike recognized the expert technique required to make such corrections appear effortless. "Perfect recovery," Mike murmured, his admiration for Sarah's abilities growing with each challenge she successfully navigated. Her flying demonstrated the kind of instinctive skill that couldn't be taught through textbooks or classroom instruction. Dr. Harrison focused on preparing for the patient transfer, felt the helicopter's movements but trusted his colleagues to handle the flying responsibilities. He had worked with many pilots over his career and could sense when an aircraft was under competent control. Despite his initial concerns about Sarah's qualifications, her performance during the flight had been flawless. The final approach required Sarah to navigate between two large cranes while dealing with turbulence created by the wind flowing around the construction site's irregular structures. She made minute adjustments to power and cyclic control, threading the helicopter through the narrow corridor with the precision of a surgeon performing delicate surgery. 5 feet, perfect alignment, Mike reported as Sarah brought the helicopter into a stable hover directly over the designated landing spot. The ground crew stood back as rotor wash scattered loose materials across the construction site. The actual touchdown was the culmination of hundreds of hours of training in challenging conditions. Sarah reduced power gradually while making continuous adjustments for wind effects, settling the helicopter onto the rough terrain with barely perceptible contact. The landing was so smooth that the only indication they had touched down was the subtle change in the aircraft's vibration characteristics. "Outstanding work," Mike said, genuine respect evident in his voice. That approach and landing would have challenged pilots with 10 times your experience. Sarah felt a wave of relief and satisfaction as she completed the post-landing checklist. Every system showed normal parameters and the helicopter was stable on the uneven ground. The most dangerous phase of the mission was complete, but their work was far from over. Dr. Harrison was already moving toward the patient before the rotor blades had completely stopped turning. The injured construction worker was conscious but clearly in critical condition. His colleagues had done their best to stabilize him, but he needed immediate transport to a trauma center equipped to handle his complex injuries. The patient transfer required careful coordination between the medical team and the construction workers who had been providing emergency care. Sarah secured the helicopter's systems and assisted with loading the patient while Mike monitored weather conditions for their return flight. The injured worker, whose name was David Chen, had fallen nearly 40 feet when scaffolding collapsed during the high winds. He had sustained multiple fractures, possible internal injuries, and was showing signs of shock despite the excellent emergency care provided by his co-workers and the on-site paramedic. "We need to get him to Metro General immediately," Dr. Harrison announced after completing his initial assessment. "His condition is stable for transport, but time is critical." Sarah began the engine restart sequence, while Dr. Harrison and his team secured the patient in the helicopter's medical configuration. Every minute counted, but safety procedures couldn't be rushed. The restart had to be executed perfectly to ensure reliable operation during the return flight. The weather conditions had improved slightly during their brief time on the ground, but significant challenges remained for the return journey. The storm system was moving through the area, creating constantly changing wind patterns and visibility conditions that would require continuous attention throughout the flight. "Metro General, this is Med Flight 7 departing the rescue site with one critical patient," Sarah radioed as she lifted off from the construction site. "Estimated arrival in 25 minutes, requesting immediate trauma team standby." The return flight tested different aspects of Sarah's piloting abilities. With a critically injured patient aboard, every movement of the helicopter had to be as smooth as possible to avoid aggravating his injuries. This required a delicate balance between maintaining efficient flight speed and minimizing turbulence effects. Dr. Harrison worked steadily to stabilize David's condition during the flight, using the helicopter's advanced medical equipment to monitor vital signs and administer treatment. Sarah could hear the medical team's communications and understood that they were fighting to keep the patient stable until they reached the hospital's trauma center. Halfway through the return flight, they encountered the most severe weather of the entire mission. The storm's leading edge created violent downdrafts and wind shear that challenged even Sarah's advanced skills. She fought to maintain smooth flight conditions while navigating around the worst of the turbulence. Mike provided navigation assistance and monitored engine parameters while Sarah focused on flying the aircraft through the increasingly difficult conditions. Their teamwork was seamless, demonstrating how effective communication could enhance safety even in the most challenging situations. "Patient's blood pressure is stabilizing," Dr. Harrison reported, his voice carrying relief and professional satisfaction. The medical intervention during transport was proving successful, but continued access to emergency surgery remained critical. As they approached Metro General Hospital, Sarah faced her final challenge of the mission. The hospital's helicopter landing pad was smaller than the construction site, and it was surrounded by tall buildings that created complex wind patterns during storms. Landing required precise control while dealing with mechanical turbulence created by the urban environment. Air traffic control provided wind-up dates and landing clearance, but ultimately the approach was Sarah's responsibility. She had practiced similar approaches during training, but never with a critical patient whose life depended on her ability to complete a safe landing. The approach to the hospital required flying between buildings while compensating for wind effects that changed dramatically as they descended. Sarah's control inputs were smooth and precise, demonstrating the advanced skill level that Tom's demanding training program had developed. The landing on the hospital's helipad was executed with textbook precision. Sarah brought the helicopter to a gentle touchdown directly on the designated spot, with minimal impact forces that wouldn't disturb the patient's condition. The medical team was ready to transfer David immediately to the trauma center for emergency surgery. As the medical team wheeled David toward the hospital, Sarah completed the post-flight shutdown procedures while Mike handled communications with hospital administration. The mission was officially complete, but the impact of what had happened was only beginning to sink in. Dr. Harrison returned from the hospital with news that David's surgery had been successful. The rapid transport had made the difference between a full recovery and potentially permanent disability or worse. The rescue mission that had begun with skepticism about Sarah's qualifications had ended with a life saved through her exceptional piloting skills. Mike approached Sarah as she finished securing the helicopter for the night. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "When you first offered to fly this mission, I thought you were overestimating your abilities. Instead, you demonstrated flying skills that exceeded what I expected from pilots with much more experience." Word of Sarah's remarkable performance spread quickly through the hospital. Within hours, she was receiving congratulations from colleagues who had heard about her secret training and extraordinary rescue mission. The nurse who had quietly pursued her flying dreams had become a local hero almost overnight. Tom Rodriguez arrived at the hospital that evening to personally congratulate his former student. "I always knew you had exceptional potential," he told Sarah. "But today, you proved that determination and proper training can overcome any obstacle." The aftermath of the rescue mission brought unexpected changes to Sarah's life. Metro General Hospital offered her a position as a backup emergency pilot while she completed her commercial certification. The unusual circumstances of the mission had demonstrated her capabilities in ways that traditional testing could never measure. 3 months later, Sarah received her commercial helicopter pilot's license and began flying regular emergency medical missions. She continued working as a nurse on her off days, combining her medical knowledge with her flying skills to provide even better patient care during transport missions. David Chen made a full recovery and returned to work 6 months after his accident. He often spoke about the nurse who had risked her career and safety to save his life, becoming an advocate for emergency medical services and the dedicated professionals who staffed them. The storm that had threatened to make the rescue mission impossible had instead provided the stage for Sarah to prove that skill, determination, and proper training could triumph over seemingly impossible odds. Her masterful performance during the Tempest became a legendary story within the emergency services community, inspiring others to pursue their dreams regardless of conventional expectations. Sarah's journey from secret flight training to emergency pilot demonstrated that sometimes the most extraordinary achievements come from people who quietly prepare for opportunities they might never get to use. When the moment arrived, she was ready, and her preparation made all the difference between tragedy and triumph.